The Longest Distance Between 2 Points by Katie Hudnall, who is here today to talk about her work. It's such an honor and a joy to have been able to put this presentation together and to work with you. And I can't wait to hear what you're going to tell us. And you're going to unlock all the secrets. It'll all be out today, and you'll have been here to see it. And thank you. I'm just going to hand it over to you. And thank you all for joining us at Museum of Art and Wood.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so the mic is working. I'm going to sit because I'm clicking through the computer. I've got some notes. So I will admit to you all that I did the terrible thing that you're not supposed to do. I revamped this talk yesterday in like the hour window that I had before things started. A little closer to my face. And so I did that, and then I tried to give it to my sister really quickly in the coffee shop this morning, and she was very patient about it. And she was like, there's 2 points that make absolutely no sense in the transition, but yesterday I knew why I did it, so maybe I'll remember today. We'll find out. Anyway, my name is Katie Hudnall, and all of the sort of strange creatures that are sitting with you out there are mine. I want to say a quick thank you to Nava and Katie and Amrit and Sophie and all of the wonderful people at this amazing museum for giving me the chance to have this show and have this talk, and for helping me set this work up, and for having the sort of like creative vision to think that my drawings should end up being giant and on the walls. That's absolutely lovely to see. I will say, and this is I think a pretty common sort of art school thing, that when I went to grad school and I started making these kind of strange furnitural things, often when I would go home, my mom would say something like, "Honey, I really love your drawings." Because I was making very strange furnitural things that are hard to explain. And so I feel like in some ways this show is, it sort of feels like it ties a younger version of me to this me in a really beautiful way. Even though my drawing practice has always been part of the practice, of the furniture practice. I'll talk about that. But it's just really absolutely lovely and wonderful to see. So thank you, Melba, for that, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Okay, so I'm gonna give background. A lot of the pictures that I'm gonna show are actually not of this work because it's here, and I thought we could just look at it. But there's sort of like background images to kind of help explain why the work looks the way that it does, because it's got a real particular look. And I thought I would just sort of start with where I grew up, where I'm from. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Virginia, Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. So the picture on my right, on my far right, on y'all's stage, whatever that is left, is the Potomac River, Old Town Alexandria. It's where my mom grew up, and it's not far from where I grew up. I grew up down the GW Parkway, which runs through Old Town Alexandria and goes all the way to Mount Vernon, and it's very green, very pretty, and I grew up on the Potomac River. The address was Architects on the Potomac. That was the name of my street. It was not street, it was on the Potomac. So if you see sort of a nautical theme or a water theme in a lot of the works, some of it is that I grew up thinking about what it was like to suddenly sort of be freed from land and be out and contained in a boat on water. I just, like, that's where my imagination went. I had this elaborate dream that I was going to steal a canoe of a neighbor and go all the way to Maryland, because Maryland was escaped somehow, and just have an adventure. I never did it, but I dreamed it a lot. So anyway, that's sort of where I'm from, and some of why the work looks the way it does. And I sort of include Old Town because it's an old city, at least for the U.S. I realize it's like dropping the bucket for other places in the world, but it has a lot of layers of history. And one of my earliest memories is noticing the high water marks in Old Town, which are sort of down by the river, the places that it's flooded, and they are these sort of like kind of quiet lines that were over my head when I was a kid. And I sort of remember growing past those lines as a child. So there's something sort of interesting to me about this sort of like layering of history, of just sort of recognizing the marks of history, and the way that they sort of change things. So that's also sort of like something that's just in me. I went to grad school. I went to art school for sculpture. I went to undergrad for illustration, I thought, and then I discovered I could make the things that I was drawing, and I never quite went back. But I eventually wound up in grad school in the Craft and Material Studies department at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, another very old city with lots of history, some of it good, some of it really, really bad and hard. And it's all layered on top of itself. And Richmond is one of those interesting cities where absolutely nothing is 90 degrees, no floor is flat, everything is wonky and non-square and beautiful and has layers of that history. So roofline of one of the walks that I did, I've always sort of been interested in the places where things transition, so like sort of seeing the city lines and the horizon has always been interesting to me. And it's a train city. That sort of very strange stormtrooper-looking thing is some defunct train bit in Richmond that I just think is a beautiful form. And it's the kind of way that I learned how to build. You'll notice that a lot of the things in the show are not, it's not always sort of fine woodworking joints. A lot of it is screwed together. I kind of taught myself how to put things together by looking at the industrial world. So that's some of that history. And layers and layers of history. These are one's from Richmond, one's actually from Philly, the stairs. And they're called architectural palimpsests. Palimpsest is a parchment that's been written on and then incompletely erased and written over again. It comes from a time when the parchment was sort of more valuable than the writing on it. But I think that the amazing thing about that is just this sort of sense of a thing used and used again and used again. And it's something that I've always been fascinated by, that we could begin to tell ourselves the stories of what has been through the marks left. So I did grad school. I was a total weirdo trying to figure out how to be a woodworker my way, how to find my voice. And I had a really amazing teacher in grad school, a woman named Susan Iverson, who was a weaver. And at some point she said, she was looking at my sketchbooks and she was looking at the rectangles that I was making over and over again. And she said, the rectangles are fine, but that's not sort of who you are. Where are the weird sort of like sketchbook versions of what you do? And she was the first person who sort of like told me that I could make the way that I drew. And what resulted, poor Susan, what resulted was this kind of like wild room. I took over essentially a closet in the gallery space that had a window in it, and I reinvented it as sort of a tinkerer's studio. And I put in sort of fake wood floors. I put things under the floors so that they would creak strangely when you walked in. I made all these kind of elaborate kind of tools. And sort of pseudo toys. The window turned into a door, and there were steps going up to the door as though you would walk in and the person who was using that space had just left. Very, very narrative, so much fun, and it was sort of an excuse to put everything I had ever made in grad school into one spot, which if any of you are in school, you sort of know that's the dream. Sort of a scientific laboratory, sort of a tinkerer space. And what I discovered was that my work likes my work, that the context for the pieces sort of like help to give the next pieces context. Like the more that I make, the more it makes sense, the more I sort of invent my own logic, a lot like drawing. That was so helpful that I sort of realized that my version of woodworking, I don't have to have the final drawing, I have to have the first drawing. And then I make something. And it's sort of interesting, but it's not really interesting in the direction I was going. It's more interesting if you flip it upside down and put a leg over here. And I just sort of realized that I could follow that and keep doing that. So I would do a drawing like this, and I'd be like, okay, he's going to be a chess player. They're going to be a chess player. Whatever. This person's going to be a chess player. And then I would sort of start working with it, and I'd think, oh no, this is somebody who doesn't have any friends. So they're just going to play chess with themselves, and it's going to spin on wheels. And that's that in the space with the door closed and the door open. And I also realized that I love humor, and I think that that there's this sort of like absurdist logic that you can follow that just instantly makes things funny. So the door had a door in it, and that door had a door in it, and that door had a door in it, and that door had a little window in it. And the window was, I don't know, like a 1/4-inch piece of glass. So other things that I'm sort of thinking about and seeing in my work, Richmond, Old City, lots of abandoned buildings. I may or may not have broken into lots of abandoned buildings, not to do any sort of nefarious things, but I really wanted to really what I like is that transition. When you're outside a space and you're looking in and it's dark, and all of the windows appear dark, and then when you walk into that space, all of a sudden, everything that's dark is light. And I'm really interested in sort of recreating that in miniature in a lot of my pieces, giving people that sense of that inside space and the life inside of a space. And it sometimes winds up in pieces in ways that I don't quite imagine. So this is a piece called Bolt Reliquary that became a home for a single bolt that I found in a bucket of bolts that my sister very kindly helped me carry up and down flights of stairs once. Thank you, Anna. Shout out. And I really wanted this sort of sense of filtered light going into the space. So this piece has this kind of ratchet below, and when you twist the ratchet, these sort of fingers open and then close back up when you release the ratcheting mechanism. And so there's this like really kind of sweet difference between it open and it closed, and it's hard to photograph. There's a photograph in between these two where you just kind of get this like light filtered light that I cut out, but for time's sake, but that's a sense of it. So I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, but the other place that I grew up was summers in my grandmother's beach house down in South Carolina. And if anyone's ever wondered why it is I believe that everything belongs on stilts, it's because of that. Just sort of walking around being like, oh, right, for like high water, you just got to put everything's got to be on stilts. But that is, like, I think that's a real big reason why, and more boats, like, that's a sort of another reason why I feel so strongly about that. And why do things look the way that they look? There's so many things I can sort of point to now and be like, I think I've just been making shrimp boats by accident for many, many years. Things that are precarious or that are just sort of hanging on and barely doing their job are really, really, really fascinating to me. There's something so sweet about a thing that's just strong enough to do the thing that it needs to do. I think there's something really beautiful about that. This is a barn in a place called Bumpus, Virginia, that I lived. Is down the street from me, and it was around a curve that I would drive every night. I was working in a cabinet shop after grad school, driving home at night, and I drove past this barn, and because it was on a curve, you would see it from one side, you'd see it from the front, it looked perfectly normal, and then you'd drive around the side and look, oh, that's not normal. But it didn't do that immediately. It actually happened after a rainstorm, that it just, one day, I think it just was like, and it tilted, and we got permission to go on the property and photograph it, and then 2 weeks later it fell. So there's this like, sort of beautiful moment, and this was where I sort of started to get obsessed with vernacular architecture, things that had been built by people who weren't architects, and who were finding the logic of it themselves, and where I started to get obsessed with this kind of, or recognize better this sort of love of light and the quality of light inside versus outside. And it sometimes takes a presentation to recognize how much of an effect a place will have on me, but I carried the inside of this barn with me in my brain and heart for a couple of years, and then I moved to Murray, Kentucky, and I made this piece, which when opened is essentially upside down, that. And I had no idea that that's sort of what I was doing, but that's what I was doing, and I think that the sort of like age quality that I've been looking for many years in my work kind of comes from that, this sense that all of these boards have been together through a lot. Sort of more things that I'm sort of thinking about as I'm moving through the road. This is a sort of a defunct coal plant in Alexandria, Virginia, near my parents, and just sort of imagining what that made. When I was a kid, I just imagined that smokestacks were making clouds. I just assumed that that's what they did, that they were sort of very, very busy cloud making. It didn't occur to me that it was pollution and that we would do that. I assumed that we were making really beautiful clouds. And just sort of thinking about the way that I see the world and think about the world, these sort of, they're hard, right? They're kind of sad where they cut trees out to run power lines through, but all I can think about is how much that's a city or a boat shape in the sky. It sort of becomes something else and something really interesting to me. I spend a lot of time outside, walking at night in particular, and the night sky has been something that has been a draw since I was a little kid. I used to sneak out of our parents' house, and I would go down to the Potomac River and just sit there. Like, I wasn't doing drugs or smoking cigarettes until high school. But I would just sort of like sit there and just like love being out in the sky. Like at night, I think the sky drops, and suddenly you can be, 5'3" and in the sky, sort of. And that's something that's been really interesting to me. This is Australia, and that's just Madison, Wisconsin at night. Just lovely to walk around. The night sort of changes everything. It makes everything a little more magical. Like, those are maple seeds on that street, and that purple light is a grow lamp. I don't know what they're growing, but that's fine. So I have sort of very unintentionally been making pieces. I shouldn't say very unintentionally, without sort of realizing it. I've made several pieces that are just about being in love with the night and being out in space and walking through it. This is called Night Sky Belly Box, and it's in the show. And it was just sort of a love letter to the stars and to a deep night sky. If you sort of look at the surface of it, you'll see it's kind of covered in this light pattern. And the top sort of references constellations and those sort of like beautiful lines that we draw, those imaginary lines that we draw to make drawings in the sky. Sort of like in that same vein, I made that piece at the beginning of 2024, I guess, along with this piece, which was obviously an ode to telescopes and being in love with the sort of like devices, the sort of devices of wonder and of sort of like the deeply curious nature of human beings, and it's also sort of about my love of the push me pull you character from Dr. Dolittle, this sort of like two-way thing. So that's this piece. It's this one. It's like very uncomplicated compared to some of the ones in the show. So somebody last night was like, "What does it do?" And I was like, "It just goes in the direction." And they were like, and I was like, I'll make it do something. I could put some noise in there or something. This is an older piece, but it probably sort of started this when I moved from Kentucky, where I had been teaching in Murray State. I lived in a barn there. The upstairs of the barn is very nice. It's a nice barn. And I had a view of the Milky Way every night, just about, unless it was a full moon. The moon in Kentucky was annoying because I lost my view of the stars. When I got to Indianapolis, where I taught for about 7 years, I suddenly couldn't see any stars ever at all. The only connection I had to the night sky was the moon. And I got really obsessed with sort of knowing where it was in its phase. So I made this for a moon-themed show that I was applying to. It's called A Half Month's Worth, and I made it over the course of a 2-week period. And each drawer gets a little bit bigger, and each drawer connects to a flag that shows the moon changing from quarter to full. So it catalogs and contains the time it took me to make this and those phases of the moon. And thinking about cataloging and collecting, and thinking about this show, which is so much about walking and collecting, I've been sort of trying to untangle my feelings about why I think walking and collecting are the same thing, and I realized it's because I grew up like by a beach essentially all summer long when I was a kid, and beachcombing was like the thing that we did. I have terrible eyesight. I have like sort of like famously bad eyesight. I used to just fall off of things all the time when I was a kid, but I also couldn't read, and so they couldn't figure out how to get me glasses because they would go to the doctor and they'd be like, "Which direction does the E point?" And I'd say, "What's an E?" And so I didn't get glasses until I was like 10. But beachcombing is this like lovely walking and like being this far away from the sand, and I could find shark's teeth. Like I was really good at sort of picking out the shapes. So I still do this, and I would lay out these kind of elaborate installations of what I would find on the beach, and my poor parents were like, "No, that's fine, dear." But it was just sort of like a thing that I did, and I still do it. This is from this past summer, actually, with my sister at the beach, and one of those things is in one of these drawers. But I think sort of like there's this funny thing that walking is and does. Walking, like in cinema, if you see somebody walking by themselves, usually it's a stand-in for the fact that they're thinking, right? Pacing. So I think walking and thinking are sort of like intricately, intimately connected, and I think walking and collecting are too. And so this sort of piece, this show sort of makes sense for me in that way, that theme. This is an early piece about collecting. I found that I had these kind of precious objects in my studio that I didn't know what to do with, and they got so precious that I couldn't touch them anymore. And I finally thought, well, I should just make them a space. Like if I can't actually use them in the work, maybe I'll just make them a place where they sort of like are an endless source of possibility. So I made this series of drawers. Each drawer contains one of these little objects that became too precious to use in the actual work. And then each one, when you open the drawer, it opens this sort of billboard on the other side. And that billboard is a drawing of an idea, one possible idea for what that thing could inspire or be. And it's right around the corner. We'll look at it in a second. But that was just sort of like a way of connecting them. And it also was a way of, for me, of like turning furniture forms into intermediaries, into moments for people to connect with each other, which is another thing that I've been really interested in for years. Like, why stop at chairs? We can go further with the furniture. I see monsters everywhere. I think pivot irrigation systems are to blame. And I'm also sort of constantly trying to figure out why the world looks the way that it does based on the objects around us. Like the sort of like the arcs that drawers sweep into floorboards, or the way that the pivot irrigation, suddenly you understand why the farmland looks like these big circles. You're like, oh, circles. There's something really lovely about that. But if you ever are wondering about why so many legs, I think that those legs are coming from a lot of different places. This is a piece in the show. I got sort of interested in thinking about these collections of things that I had and how I would make something that could become a protector for it, but not like a safe, something that would really be like a guardian for it, and how to give agency to the furniture forms that were sort of protecting these things. And of course, eyeballs are the answer to that. If something is staring at you very strongly with 6 eyes, you're going to be more careful with its contents. Philly, I realize the time, I'm going to scoot up a little bit. Philadelphia has been a really big influence on my work. I've come here twice, once in 2016 and once in 2022, and spent most of a summer here. And those summers have been remarkable, because talk about a city with amazing overlapping histories, and a city that's so walkable, assuming that you can deal with cobblestones and bricks, and a city that just like has so much going on. In 2016, I made a piece that's in the show that's at the back, and I was walking around, I was taking all these pictures of palimpsests, and then a very nice gentleman named Scott Kipp gave me and the group that I was with for the residency a tour of the Wanamaker organ in the Macy's building, or Wanamaker building, and it sort of clicked for me, this love and interest in the systems inside of buildings. And this, if you've never been, it's like 7 floors, I'm going to get all the numbers wrong, I'm sorry, Scott, of just thousands of pipe organs running through this thing that gets played by one sort of central thing. And there are hints of it through the walls, but essentially what's happening in the walls is this, and there are ladders and all these sort of like crawl spaces to kind of get to different parts of it. And the idea that all of a sudden you could change HVAC or plumbing or electrical systems and replace that with a system for just making wild sounds was like sort of a remarkable shift for me about like what kinds of systems can we put in our buildings. If we can make one that makes sounds, we can make one that does anything. So that was sort of like stewing in me. And meanwhile, Philadelphia, busy, like so many lines crisscrossing everywhere, so many lives crisscrossing everywhere. I ended up making this thing. I was here, I was thinking about this rushing, fast city, lines going everywhere. I was thinking about this really sad, projected breakup that I was at the very beginning of, and I made this kind of couples counseling jewelry box. It's got 19 buttons on the back and then 19 boxes in the front. You don't know which thing connects to which thing, so it's sort of like click the button over there. No, honey, not that one. No, honey, not that one. No, honey, not that one. Maybe it's the one over there. No, it's not that one. And it was just sort of like a piece to get people to talk to each other or sort of thinking about that. But it actually, it makes sense sort of. I'm still sort of thinking about collections here, and I'm thinking about how to make a thing special for other people, how to bring wonder back to something. And I'm thinking about maps and cities and the ways that like industrial spaces, human spaces overlap and connect with natural spaces. And during the pandemic, I found this branch on the ground, and it had fallen down in a storm in Indianapolis. I was still there. It was in Madison, I can't remember. Anyway, early on in the pandemic, and it was one year's worth of growth, right? Just sort of wiped out in this storm, just for this one branch. So I called this a container for a lost year, thinking about the way that the pandemic sort of knocked out, in some ways, a year's worth of growth for us, sometimes much more. But I was also thinking about maps and about rivers and the way that they sort of cut through cities. And we say that even though like the river was there before the city. And I wanted to sort of like honor that a little bit, talk about the messiness while trying to contain it at the same time. Okay, so back to thinking about internal and external systems that can do more than just run water and electricity and air to us. And then thinking about this last year of making, it kind of started for me when the school year ended in May, and I went to an amazing residency at a place called Haystack Mountain School of Crafts up in Deer Elming. It's absolutely beautiful. It runs right down to the water, and it's like this big open campus where you can kind of see through and around all these spaces, and wind runs through it constantly. So I applied to do this for a 2-week residency just basically to like put whirligigs all over the damn campus. Any place that there was wind. And I thought of it as the wind system, like just so you know the wind was there whenever you needed to. And that was the start of whirligigs. I did that, it was magical. I also made a bunch of ceramic cups. Shout out to ceramicists, that was fun. And I came back to Madison, to my studio, knowing that I was about to make this monster. And I had been working on making this monster for a while in parts. The legs are all glued up from plaster lath pieces. So everything in the show, everything's made from found materials. And this piece in particular, I never find anything long enough to make something that's 30 inches long. Usually the things that I find are fairly small. So in order to make the legs on this, I just had to glue things together in 20-inch sections, quarter-inch pieces, and I'd glue 4 or 5 of those at a time and make squares. So I had made buckets of those, and then I came back and I made this piece. And again, thinking about systems and how systems can do something other than what we sort of like imagine them to do, how they can carry other kinds of information, and thinking about maps. And I put this slide up because the first time I installed it is the image on y'all's right, getting it right, my assistant helped me set this up. Sam Northcutt, absolutely amazing grad at UW-Madison, and he is a quilter, and he is incredibly organized. And he's like, well, I think that we can just do this system, we just measure it out, and we put it up, and it was like sort of too, it didn't react to itself enough. It was too sort of like set in its way. It's beautiful, but it's like everyone came in and they're like, oh, church. That was kind of the first thing they said, and I was like, oh no, that was not the vibe. And so at some point I said, Sam, let's set it up again, and very, very sweetly said, okay, no big deal, that's fine, that's a week of my life I'll never get back. And so I put up the pulleys, and then I guessed where the flags should go, ran the strings, changed things around, patched holes, figured it out, and all of a sudden it went from being church to being switchboard or being map, and that was sort of what I wanted. Everything in these drawers are things that I've collected on walks around Philly and every other place that I have lived, and what I want people to sort of be thinking about is those connections that I now have to people who lost those things. So all the past me's that have walked around the city, all the past people who walked around the city, and how we all sort of like overlap and tie ourselves to each other in this accidental way that's really lovely. And the drawers hold all kinds of weird shit that people use. I try not to pick up anything super gross. That's my only rule. Is I won't pick up gross things. What does gross mean? Like things that were intentionally discarded, but things that were lost or things that are broken and fallen off. Then as the summer got done, I put that piece away and I went to Corsicana, Texas, where there's a residency in this beautiful building. Corsicana, Texas is wide and broad and flat, and things just sort of go on forever. And so the pieces in this show that reach and stretch, the one that you also are sitting around, the blower, was made in this space. And the one that holds a maple seed right when you first walk in, that was made in this space. And the herd that's sort of up in the front looking out those windows was made in this space. And it's just to say, I've never gotten to make artwork in a space that was as big as a gallery before, but this was my studio space and my bedroom. And it's an old Oddfellows building, it's 3,000 square feet. And then the guy who ran residency said, oh yeah, I'm a woodworker, do you want to use the ground floor too? And I said, yes, please. And so, like, what can you do when you can sort of think past a 9-foot ceiling? As it turns out, you can drop a maple seed really beautifully. So that's kind of where some of this work came from. And I thought, since this stuff is actually here, that I would go through these images really quick, and then maybe take questions. I'm a little past time, and then we can, if you'd like, I can sort of walk around and kind of show you how these things work. Does anyone have any questions?
Would you say that art is like I guess a window to your own world? You were describing how you kind of like saw things like monsters or multiple windows.
Right.
Is this kind of just like what goes on in your mind, just how you see things?
It's like I always think of it as like yes, it's that for sure, but it's also like collaborative because things are so much more interesting when you actually start building them than, my drawings have been with me since I was a kid, but my drawings have been hugely influenced by my making practice. And my making practice has then been hugely influenced by my drawing. So I've been like going back and forth for a while. If you put something up on like a couple of legs that you just clamped to the side of it just to see if it'll stand, and then you're like, oh no, that's good. Then all of a sudden, yeah, exactly. So it's like a collaboration between the objects and me, usually. Anybody else? Questions?
Do you have any specific inspirations of other artists or artifacts that you look at?
That's a great question. I usually have that in my presentation. I didn't include it. My first sort of like huge inspirations are actually illustrators. Edward Gorey for the sort of incredible detailed kind of like backgrounds of all of his drawings. I would say Shel Silverstein for like the economy of his sort of like drawing work and the fact that he always puts people in incredibly precarious places. And I think that my titles are really influenced by Shel Silverstein. And Quentin Blake, who illustrated all of the Roald Dahl books when I was a kid, that was sort of my introduction to him, although he's got lots of illustrations for other things. And there's like a speed and a sketchiness and a sort of economy is probably the right word again, with his drawings that are just, there's an aliveness to his work that is absolutely wonderful that I would like to mimic. So those would be my like first influences, and then it's funny, I look at a lot of non-furniture people, but I will say that Martin Esherick, who the Wharton Esherick Museum is up in Bucks County, like that his space, as much of his work, but the way that he sort of created space for himself has been an influence. Sure. Anybody else? Hi.
Hi.
Adam.
So I know a lot of your wood is sourced from like secondhand or like found places.
Yeah.
Do you find that like what is the collaboration sort of process like for you to be able to source wood from these kind of places?
It's a lot of climbing into dumpsters, which always sounds really sexy, but it's not. The material, it looks old, it looks aged, but I actually do a lot of cleaning up so that I can run it through my tools so that I can be safe with it. Things are covered in lead paint. And so I'm finding ways to mitigate that. Usually I'm sawing the lead paint part off so that I don't actually cut into it. And I have kind of an elaborate, like I drive around in my little truck and I walk alleys and I look at especially restoration sites outside of old buildings because the materials they're tearing out are going to be old growth usually. The materials are just going to be probably nicer, denser. And then like once a month, I just like look in the back of my truck at all of the stuff I collected and I think, why did you do this? And I have a day of pulling nails and organizing it by size. And I put that away. I'm very organized because I'm incredibly scatterbrained. So if I don't have like an external organizational system, I just wander around looking for a pencil for days. And I half the time can't remember that I'm looking for a pencil. It's terrible. And so then when I'm starting with something, sometimes I've found a piece that has a really interesting hole in it. And I'm like, ooh, what am I going to do with that? Sometimes I have a drawing and I'm like, what's the right size, shape, material for it? But it really depends. Like I have sketchbooks that I have flagged for when I'm really, really lost. Like when I have artist block, what do? I don't go to a flagged page. But every once in a while, like there'll be this sort of line of things I want to make, and a piece of material will show up with something really beautiful on it, marks or something, and I'll be like, oh no, that just jumped in front of the line. I'm doing something with that. I don't know what yet. So it's like, it's not. I wish I had like a very organized answer, but it's like it really kind of depends. Anybody else?
I'm not sure I have a question, but I was intrigued by your comment about connection between walking and thinking.
Yeah.
And I was reminded of some poets. I mean, Wordsworth, for example, walked and I don't know how the hell he did it, but he wasn't like taping it, he was actually walking and yeah. So anyway, can you want to say a little bit more about that? I'm intrigued by that.
Totally. I think it's been really interesting. So I'm 7 years sober, and when I got sober, I started walking at night instead of drinking, and that's part of where the walking practice came. And it was like such a surprising lift for me in terms of like health. Aside from the physical, and aside from like being sober, like walking, I would just process my day, and I would find myself halfway through my walk, and I'd be like, "Oh, I've been angry all day," and I didn't know it. I was holding this thing in, and I would suddenly be like, "Oh yeah," and I would have this like retort to somebody who said something in the day, and I'd be like, "Oh, I just processed this." Like I was metabolizing my day by actually walking myself kind of like back into my body and into my brain because I'd sort of been externally focused all day. And so, I think it's been really interesting. And I'm only now doing things like I'm reading, Rebecca Solnit wrote a book called The Field Guide to Getting Lost, which is really beautiful, and about a little bit about walking, about moving through space, and about distance. And that's been really lovely. And if you have recommendations, I would love them, because there are so many books about walking and about how good for you walking is. And I think walking for me, I made this piece that called Nutcase, which holds 178 acorns, and they're the 178 acorns that I collected the first year that I walked, the first year I got sober. And I was thinking about acorns in relationship to sobriety. Like every day that I'm sober, is another day. And it's tiny, it's like not, it is nothing to celebrate, but all of them together you can celebrate. And so the acorns were sort of metaphorical for that, because an oak tree produces like 2,000 acorns in a growing season if it's producing. They don't every year, but like only like 1 in 10,000 makes it to maturity. Only 1 in 10,000 becomes a tree. And so thinking about this like sort of constant like little effort to like get something, to get somewhere, felt really valuable to me. And I think walking feels like that. On days when, and I know I'm able-bodied, so I have a lot of privileges, but like on days when I can't do anything else, I can still walk. And that's huge. Yeah.
This isn't exactly a question, just more of a comment or thoughts about. I don't know that much work that I can say feels as generous to me as yours does, and also just for me encapsulates this idea of a kind of joy that comes from attention. And I was thinking about that because I just recently listened to a podcast with Robin Wall Kimmerer,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And she said, gratitude requires attention.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm seeing all those things in here, like joy that comes from that kind of attentiveness to things. And then I also see both generosity from you, but also gratitude in there. So it's beautiful. Thank you. And
thank you. I didn't talk about joy, but that's like one of the sort of themes is that like I hope that people recognize that I love making the work, that that's just sort of like in the pieces themselves, and I feel like usually that's pretty apparent, that like I wander around clapping and like shouting for joy a lot in my studio space, because I do. I have like an incredibly low threshold for delight, and I think that that's something I have to share, like thinking about like what, there's this question that people start to ask you at a certain point in your career, which is like, why do you think your career matters to the field? And you think, I don't know. I just made the thing with the acorns in it. That it seemed like a good idea. I needed a place for my acorns. But I think like that something like this is speaking museum language, right? It's speaking the language of importance. Like these things matter because I made drawers for them. And I'm doing that so that I can say that these 3 lighters that I found on the ground in Madison, Wisconsin matter. And these little bottle caps, and like this maple seed. And I think it's a way of sort of like subversively a little bit, but playfully using language of importance to remind people that the world right now, as it is wonderful. Do you guys want to see a maple seed fall? Yeah. All right, let's do that.